The avoidant operates from a fundamental assumption about the people who love them, that those people are blind to their patterns, unaware of their emotional limitations, and naively hopeful that things will change if they just love hard enough. This assumption serves a crucial psychological function for the avoidant. It allows them to maintain their self-concept as mysterious and unknowable, while simultaneously feeling superior to those who pursue them. The avoidant believes they're getting away with their emotional unavailability because their partner doesn't fully understand what's happening, doesn't see the patterns clearly, doesn't grasp the depth of their defensive structure. But there comes a moment, usually after the relationship has ended and the avoidant has had time to reflect, when a devastating truth penetrates their awareness. You were never naive. You saw everything. Every withdrawal, every defense mechanism, every moment of emotional unavailability. You understood their attachment patterns perhaps better than they understood them themselves. You weren't blindly hoping they would change. You were making conscious, informed choices about how much of their behavior you could accept while maintaining your own integrity. The avoidant realizes that what they interpreted as naivety was actually something far more sophisticated and far more threatening to their self-concept. You were observing them the entire time, seeing them clearly, and choosing your responses with full awareness of what you were dealing with. This realization changes everything about how the avoidant understands the relationship, your departure, and themselves. They realize you knew about attachment theory all along. The first crack in the avoidant's assumption of your naivety often comes when they discover, either through direct evidence or gradual realization, that you understood attachment theory. Perhaps they come across a book on your shelf they never noticed before, or a friend mentions conversations you had about avoidant patterns, or they remember things you said that reveal deep knowledge of how their psychology works. The avoidant experiences a disorienting shift. Everything they thought about the dynamic between you suddenly appears in a different light. The avoidant realizes that when you gave them space, you weren't doing so out of ignorance or because you didn't care enough to pursue them. You were giving them space because you understood that pursuing an avoidant triggers their flight response and creates more distance. When you remained calm during their withdrawals, you weren't unaffected or oblivious. You were regulating your own anxiety because you understood that your panic would only compound their need to escape. When you didn't take their emotional unavailability personally, you weren't failing to see it. You were recognizing it as their attachment pattern, rather than as a statement about your worth. This recognition is deeply unsettling for the avoidant, because it means they were never in control of the dynamic the way they believed. They thought they were managing someone who didn't fully understand what was happening, but you understood perfectly. You knew exactly what you were dealing with. You made conscious choices about how to engage with an avoidant attachment style, which means your eventual decision to leave wasn't born from ignorance or impatience. It was born from informed assessment that the relationship couldn't meet your needs despite your best efforts. The avoidant also realizes that your understanding of attachment theory means you saw patterns they didn't even see in themselves. You recognized when they were deactivating, when their defenses were rising, when intimacy was triggering their flight response. You probably understood their behavior better than they did because you had the objectivity and knowledge to name what was happening. This is profoundly humbling for the avoidant, who has always prided themselves on being the most self-aware person in their relationships. What makes this realization particularly painful is understanding that you gave them exactly what attachment theory suggests, giving an avoidant space, patience, acceptance of their limitations, no pressure for premature intimacy. You did everything right, according to the literature on loving avoidance, and it still didn't work. This means the relationship didn't fail because you didn't understand them. It failed because understanding them wasn't enough to make the fundamental incompatibility sustainable. The avoidant confronts that they were being studied, in a sense, which triggers their deep discomfort with being known. They realized that your questions weren't random curiosity. They were assessments. Your patience wasn't naivety. It was strategy based on knowledge. Your acceptance wasn't blindness. It was informed choice. Everything they thought was happening beneath your awareness was actually happening in full view, and you were consciously deciding how to respond rather than unconsciously reacting. They understand you were setting boundaries, not playing games. The avoidant has a tendency to interpret boundaries as manipulation or game playing. When you pulled back after they withdrew, the avoidant assumed you were trying to make them jealous or punish them for their distance. When you established limits on how much emotional unavailability you would accept, the avoidant saw it as an ultimatum designed to control them. When you stopped initiating contact as frequently, the avoidant believed you were testing them or trying to make them chase you. These interpretations allowed the avoidant to maintain their victim narrative. They were the one being manipulated, pressured, or played with. But in retrospect, with the clarity that distance provides, the avoidant begins to see these behaviors differently. You weren't playing games. You were setting boundaries to protect your own emotional well-being while engaging with someone whose patterns were harmful to your mental health. You pulled back when they withdrew, not as a strategy, but as self-preservation. You were matching their energy to avoid the pain of pursuing someone who was running away. You established limits not to control them, but to maintain your own integrity and self-respect. The avoidant realizes that healthy boundaries actually look like what you were doing, clearly communicating what you needed, following through with consequences when those needs weren't met, and prioritizing your own well-being rather than abandoning yourself to accommodate someone else's limitations. The confusion the avoidant experienced wasn't because you were being inconsistent or manipulative. It was because they had never encountered someone who maintained boundaries while still remaining in relationship with them. This recognition is uncomfortable because it means the avoidant's complaints about being pressured or controlled were actually complaints about being held accountable. You weren't trying to change them. You were simply refusing to accept treatment that harmed you. You weren't demanding that they become someone different. You were asking for basic emotional presence and reciprocity. The avoidant labeled these reasonable expectations as excessive demands because acknowledging them as reasonable would have required looking at their own behavior as inadequate. The avoidant also realizes that your boundaries became stricter over time, not because you were escalating manipulation, but because you were learning through experience what you could and couldn't tolerate. You didn't start the relationship with rigid boundaries. You developed them in response to repeated patterns of behavior that caused you pain. Each boundary was earned through the avoidant's consistent demonstration that without clear limits, they would take more than they gave and withdraw more than they engaged. What the avoidant understands now is that when you finally enforced your ultimate boundary, leaving the relationship, it wasn't a dramatic gesture or a bluff designed to make them fight for you. It was the logical endpoint of a process you'd been communicating about all along. You had been saying, in various ways, what you needed to continue in the relationship. When those needs consistently went unmet, you followed through on the boundary you'd been establishing. The avoidant mistook your patience for willingness to wait forever, but you were actually giving them time to demonstrate change while preparing yourself emotionally for the likely reality that change wouldn't come. They see that your questions weren't naive, they were assessments. Throughout the relationship, the avoidant likely experienced your questions as endearing or slightly frustrating evidence of your lack of understanding. When you asked about their need for space, they thought you didn't grasp their independence. When you inquired about their feelings, they assumed you couldn't accept that they didn't process emotions the way you did. When you sought clarity about where the relationship was going, they believed you were being needy or impatient. The avoidant answered these questions with varying degrees of honesty, often providing just enough information to satisfy you while maintaining their emotional privacy. But looking back, the avoidant realizes your questions served a different purpose than they understood at the time. You weren't asking because you didn't understand. You were asking because you were gathering data. You were assessing whether the relationship could meet your needs, whether the avoidance patterns were temporary or permanent, whether their emotional limitations were something they were working on or something they considered fixed. Each question was an evaluation disguised as curiosity. The avoidant recognizes now that you were giving them opportunities to be honest, to show self-awareness, to demonstrate willingness to work on their patterns. When you asked if they saw a future together, you weren't pressuring them for commitment. You were assessing whether investing more time in the relationship was wise. When you asked about their previous relationships, you weren't being jealous. You were looking for patterns that would tell you what to expect. When you asked how they felt about you, you weren't fishing for reassurance. You were gauging the emotional reality of the connection. What makes this recognition particularly striking is realizing how much you already knew before you asked. You often asked questions you already had answers to, watching to see if the avoidant would be honest, or if they would deflect, minimize, or provide the answer they thought you wanted to hear. You were testing for integrity, for self-awareness, for willingness to be vulnerable. The avoidant thought they were managing your perception, but you were actually assessing their character. The avoidant also understands that the evolution of your questions map the evolution of your understanding. Early questions were genuinely exploratory. You were trying to understand how they worked. Middle stage questions were confirmatory. You were testing whether your observations matched reality. Late stage questions were almost rhetorical. You already knew the answers, and were giving the avoidant one more chance to surprise you with honesty or growth. The avoidant failed to recognize this progression, treating all your questions as equally naive. This realization is humbling because it means the avoidant wasn't as mysterious or complex as they believed. You had them figured out, probably early in the relationship. Your continued questions weren't evidence that you didn't understand. They were evidence that you were hoping to be wrong about what you were seeing, giving them chances to demonstrate depth or self-awareness they hadn't yet shown. The avoidant's smugness about being unknowable is replaced with the uncomfortable recognition that they were quite predictable to someone paying attention. They recognize you left at exactly the right time, not impulsively. The avoidant typically experiences the ending of a relationship as sudden and unexpected. Even when there were months of warnings, conversations, and expressed dissatisfaction leading up to it. They're genuinely shocked when someone leaves, because they've minimized all the signs that departure was coming. In the avoidance narrative, you left impulsively, reactively, perhaps during a moment of conflict, or after a specific incident. They tell themselves that if you'd just been more patient, more understanding, more willing to accept their limitations, the relationship could have continued. But with time and reflection, the avoidant begins to see a different truth. You didn't leave impulsively. You left at precisely the moment when it became undeniably clear that the pattern wasn't going to change, that the avoidant wasn't going to do the work required for the relationship to be healthy, that continuing would mean betraying your own needs and worth. Your timing wasn't reactive. It was the result of careful observation and assessment. The avoidant realizes you probably knew the relationship was ending long before you actually ended it. You likely spent weeks or months in a process of internal preparation, grieving the relationship while still in it, emotionally detaching to protect yourself, making practical plans for what your life would look like without them. By the time you actually left, you had already done most of the work of letting go. What looked like a sudden decision was actually the final step in a long process the avoidant wasn't paying attention to. This recognition includes understanding that you gave them multiple chances to change the trajectory. You communicated your needs clearly. You expressed when you were unhappy or feeling neglected. You probably even explicitly warned them that you couldn't continue indefinitely in a relationship that wasn't meeting your needs. The avoidant heard these communications, but didn't believe you would actually follow through. They thought your love or your patience was infinite, or they assumed you were just being emotional and didn't really mean it. The avoidant sees now that your departure wasn't about a specific incident, but about a pattern that had proven itself unchangeable. You didn't leave because of one fight, one withdrawal, or one disappointment. You left because you'd seen enough repetitions of the same cycle to know it was the cycle itself, not a temporary phase. You recognized that the avoidance patterns were deeply entrenched, that they weren't working on changing them, and that hoping for different results while nothing fundamental changed was denial rather than optimism. What's particularly striking to the avoidant in hindsight is recognizing all the moments when you could have left but didn't. You stayed through multiple cycles of withdrawal and return. You forgave repeated instances of emotional unavailability. You accepted explanations and promises that the avoidant didn't follow through on. Each time you stayed, the avoidant assumed it meant you would always stay. But you were actually using that time to confirm what you suspected, that the pattern was fixed, not situational. The avoidant also realizes that you left while you still had the strength to do so. You didn't wait until you were completely depleted, bitter, or destroyed by the relationship. You left while you still had enough self-respect and emotional resources to build a life without them. This timing, which the avoidant initially experienced as cruel or premature, was actually evidence of your wisdom and self-preservation. You knew that waiting longer would only make leaving harder and healing more difficult. They understand you chose conscious acceptance, not blind hope. Perhaps the most profound realization for the avoidant is understanding the nature of your acceptance of their limitations. The avoidant assumed your acceptance meant you didn't fully grasp how limited they were, or that you naively believed love would eventually overcome those limitations. They thought you were in denial about the reality of who they were and what they could offer. This assumption allowed the avoidant to feel superior, while also feeling secure that you would continue accepting whatever they offered. But the truth is more complex and more sophisticated than the avoidant gave you credit for. You weren't accepting their limitations because you didn't see them or didn't understand their implications. You were accepting those limitations with full awareness of what you were signing up for, making a conscious choice about what you could live with and what would ultimately become unsustainable. Your acceptance was informed, not naive. The avoidant realizes you are operating from a framework of radical acceptance, seeing them clearly, understanding exactly what they could and couldn't give, and consciously choosing to engage with that reality rather than with a fantasy of who they might become. You weren't hoping they would change into someone more emotionally available. You were accepting them as they were while simultaneously being realistic about whether that would be enough for you long term. This type of acceptance is actually more challenging and more mature than blind hope. It requires holding two truths simultaneously, that someone is doing the best they can with their current limitations, and that their best might not be enough for a healthy relationship. You loved the avoidant while also seeing clearly that loving them didn't solve the fundamental incompatibility between their capacity and your needs. The avoidant also understands now that your acceptance had limits, and those limits were healthy rather than evidence of conditional love. You accepted the avoidant's need for space, but you didn't accept being ignored for weeks. You accepted their difficulty with verbal expressions of affection, but you didn't accept total emotional stonewalling. You accepted their slower pace of intimacy, but you didn't accept stagnation or regression. The boundaries around your acceptance were clear. The avoidant just didn't take them seriously until you enforced them by leaving. What the avoidant failed to understand during the relationship was that conscious acceptance can coexist with the decision to leave. You could accept them exactly as they were, while also accepting that who they were couldn't give you what you needed for a fulfilling relationship. Acceptance doesn't mean staying in situations that harm you. It means seeing reality clearly and making informed choices based on that reality. The avoidant recognizes that you were playing a much longer game than they realized. You weren't focused on day-to-day emotions or temporary satisfaction. You were assessing whether the relationship had the fundamental ingredients for long-term health and sustainability. When you determined it didn't, not because the avoidant was bad or broken, but because the incompatibility was structural rather than circumstantial. You made the difficult choice to leave. This realization is perhaps the most humbling for the avoidant because it means they were never fooling you. You saw them clearly from the beginning. You understood their patterns, recognized their limitations, and made informed choices about how to engage with them. When you finally left, it wasn't because you suddenly saw who they really were. It was because you'd known who they really were all along, and had reached the limit of what you could accept while maintaining your own well-being. The avoidant wasn't as mysterious, as complex, or as successful at hiding their patterns as they believed. You were just observing, assessing, and waiting to see if anything would shift enough to make the relationship viable. When it became clear nothing would, you acted on the information you'd been gathering all along.